conspiratorial approach failed to adequately consider the legal and practical implications of what they need to do. So, by the way, they said to them, okay, the EPA did this. They said, okay, states, you go ahead and make your own rules. Like, you clean it up, create your own militia at the state. They gave them that leeway. You come up with plans to stop this pollution, and then we'll take a look at it, and as long as it's not bullshit, we'll step back from what you do. So at the end of that, they looked at their plans, they were like, this is fucking bullshit. And then they actually cracked down. That's when the lawsuits came, and now the Supreme Court is going, yeah, let industry do what the fuck they want. We don't care.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's like, even when the Supreme Court, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's jump ahead to the other case, because this one actually is on the mind. What I mentioned before is actually from this case. We've had so many, I'm losing track here, but the Supreme Court limits the power of the SEC to unilaterally enforce financial fraud regulations.
Yeah, so this is the white-collar criminal get out of jail free card, basically.
Yeah, so the backstory on this one is that basically somebody who's a fraudster.
Basically.
Yes, so the Supreme Court limits the power of the SEC to unilaterally enforce financial fraud regulations.
Yeah, so this is the white-collar criminal get out of jail free card, basically.
Yeah, so the voice is going. The backstory on this one is that basically somebody who's a fraudster was suing for the right to have a civil jury trial, to get his punishment then. But there's a different way of doing it through the SEC, where it's quicker, it's more efficient, and they have that because there's a massive backlog in the federal trials, and they needed some other way to do it, right? And they've been doing it like this for a long time. It's basically like a basic government regulation type thing.
Yeah.
And this guy said,
precedent. This isn't some new wild and crazy thing the Biden administration just made up. This is
it's been like this for a very, very long time.
A lot of these type of fraud cases are resolved.
And it was a 6-3 ruling. They were like, yeah, the basic SEC regulation to stop financial fraudsters. Now we're going to throw it back to the courts. And when they throw it back to the courts now, it's going to be a really, really long time. The backlog just got worse. It basically is like a green light. Like, you'll probably get away with it if you do some fraud now.
Yeah. Well, and this is also part of the conservative justice's assault on the quote-unquote administrative state. There's a whole thing there with regards to the Chevron doctrine. I don't know if you guys have heard. This is like, if you're a conservative, you definitely know what this is. But the idea is effectively, right now, Congress passes legislation, and there's some bandwidth for the various regulatory agencies to be able to interpret and then enforce that legislation. And what the conservatives want to move towards is really clipping the wings of that quote-unquote administrative state. And basically, if it's not specifically laid out in legislation from Congress, then they say, oh, you don't have the power to do that. And so this falls into that category of that, antipathy towards and attack on the administrative state. And, it may sound fine in theory, but in reality, it just makes it very, very difficult for the government to do anything whatsoever. It takes power away from their ability to rein in corporate power. I mean, that's one of the primary reasons why there is such a desire to have this attack on the administrative state. So this fits in all with that. It is a good illustration of the type of thing that the conservative justices are pushing towards, which again, really, once again, tilts the scale in favor of corporations, white-collar criminals, their cohort that has put them there in power.
So I found the quote I was looking for. The 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, so the lower court, which, that eventually led to this Supreme Court case, but this is the same case. They said, Congress improperly delegated legislative power to the SEC, giving the agency authority to choose the in-house administrative route rather than a federal court.
See, so in other words,
yes, what that means is, basically, even though Congress said, SEC, you go ahead and do this,
right,
we're saying, no, we disagree. Because normally the Supreme Court dodge and the court dodge is like, oh, go ahead and let them do that, right?
Well, normally the dodge is like, well, if Congress wants it, they can pass legislation.
Right.
And now Congress is like, okay, but we did.
And they're like, no,
and now we're
going to override you anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is what conservatives used to talk about, the legislating from the bench.
That's what this is, yeah.
That's what this is,
so
right?
Congress says X.
It's putting themselves in the position of supremacy. They're supposed to be co-equal branches. This is the judiciary, the judicial branch saying, no, actually, we're superior we're going to tell you what you're allowed to do here with regards to this very specific administrative capacity. We don't like what you did, so we're going to make a different rule.
Because their dodges leave it to Congress. And in this case, it's like they did leave it to Congress. And they're like, okay, then we'll just override Congress. So they're going to always... That's the thing. The law is fake. Right? Like, they just go back to what are their ideological priors, and we'll make that the law. And we'll find some rationalization. And the thing that nobody will tell you, but I will, is everybody does that. Whether you're on the left or on the right, everybody's doing that. But they have this highfalutin bullshit about how, no, we go by the letter of the law.
Yeah.
Like, do you really?
No,
you just overturned Congress when Congress said the SEC can do this for financial fraudsters. They could basically have their own trial process for the financial fraudsters. You threw that out.
Right.
Insane.
Yeah,
Insane.
Truly.
All right, so that's how the Supreme Court is fucking us in 1,000 different ways.
Okay, that was lovely.
Now, before we
felt great.
Before we get to our guests, I wanted to talk about the new numbers that just came out. Nate Silver released his prediction for the presidential election. Now, again, I have to be clear. This is pre-debate we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Not post-debate. The numbers, I'm sure, will change one way or the other post-debate. But according to Nate Silver, as of right now, the election were today, Trump has a 65.7% chance of winning the election. He also predicts that Biden is slightly more likely, 51%, to win the popular vote.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, because some of that had shifted.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Where there was a theory, Democrats have long had advantage in the popular vote and disadvantage in the electoral college because of some of the realignments that have happened with suburban college-educated voters shifting into the Democratic Party and working-class voters of a variety of stripes shifting into the Republican Party. There was a thought that might be changing, so interesting that he calculates no, it still is the fact that Democrats have more advantage in the popular vote.
Yeah, so I'll ask you up front here before I get to the 538 number, which is not the Nate Silver number.
Right.
What do you think of that number?
Feels about right to me.
It feels about right to you, 65.7%? Because, you look at somebody like Jay Huger would say it's a 95% chance Biden's going to lose.
I don't think that. And some days I think maybe he is going to win. And we'll see how this debate goes tonight, and maybe that's just the thinking again, because I do think that even though debates, all the political scientists say, they don't really matter, they don't really should change anything. First of all, I don't really buy that anyway, but second of all, because the question was Biden, one of the really central questions is just is this dude too old to do this? I think that makes this debate more consequential because it's an opportunity for people to assess for themselves whether or not they feel that is the case. But yeah, just looking at the polling, looking at Biden's approval rating, looking at how people feel about the economy, looking at the way that the way he's supporting a genocide, about the objections of an overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party, and over the absolute disgust and horror the young voters of the Democratic Party is so dependent on. You have to feel like it's Trump's game to lose. Now, on the other hand,
Convicted felon.
Trump is a convicted felon.
Extremist.
Fucking insane. He's an extremist.
His candidates got thrown out the other night in the mid-elections that there were.
And I was remembering, preparing for the debate coverage tonight, I was remembering his proudly stand by moment.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't really know if that made a difference in the electorate, but looking back on it and then seeing the midterm results and how there was this repulsion to the extremism coming through the Republican Party, I do think it was moments like that were really proud for him. There are a bit of rose-colored glasses right now with regard to Trump and the way things were under Trump and whatever. As we get more and more into the election cycle and he's in front of people's faces more, the Biden campaign is running more and more negative ads. That recollection may be refreshed. He may help people refresh that recollection because he just can't help himself from being insane. So, I don't think it's over. I don't think it's over for Biden. I think he could win, but I definitely think he's the underdog at this point.
So the 538 numbers, and again, 538 is not Nate Silver anymore. They're together. This is a separate algorithm, separate that they use. According to their numbers, they have Biden at a 50% chance of winning and Trump at a 49% chance of winning, which I find very interesting.
I think the Nate numbers are...
I think they're more accurate too, because I read more about his formula in particular, and making a point which has been sticking with me for a while, which is it used to be the case there was a secret Trump/Republican vote, but in that election cycle, it's the opposite. There's a secret Democratic vote that's out there. And, in the primaries, like was pointed out, Trump underperformed polling by 8 points across the board in virtually every single primary, even up against Nikki Haley after she dropped out, right? And so I thought, Trump in a lot of the polls.
Yeah.
And Nate Silver basically, he wrote a piece on this, and he basically explained, like, I'm accounting for this basically like secret Democratic vote, which has been in the past 3 or 4 election cycles. I have that as part of my formula.
Yeah.
And the fact that he said that, plus he has Trump at about 65%, that just feels about right to me. But again, we're recording this before the debate. Who knows what will happen at the debate? That could possibly change stuff. There's a million. If Israel goes to war with Hezbollah and Biden, like a fucking moron, goes right in there with them, then you're looking at a Trump 85% chance, right? Ain't gonna rally around the flag for that shit. Hezbollah didn't just attack Reading Central Station, right? Hey, I should be careful because I might pull a false flag up or something, right? But, like, you know what I'm saying? There won't be a rally on the flag. It won't be like, we'll support our leader in these times of crisis. What the fuck are you doing? Fighting Israel's war for them, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Getting us back into the Middle East when, yeah, exactly. No, it would be utter catastrophe. Sometimes my opinion will shift because, for example, there was that special election in Ohio where...
This is without a doubt one of the more embarrassing stories that we've covered recently, and I'm here to bring it to you. So according to The Guardian, conservative U.S. lawmakers are now pushing for an end to no-fault divorce. Republicans in Louisiana, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Texas have discussed eliminating or restricting such cases. So here's what they say. Some prominent conservative lawmakers and commentators are advocating for ending no-fault divorce, laws that exist in all 50 U.S. states, and allow a person to end a marriage without having to prove a spouse did something wrong, like commit adultery or domestic violence. The socially conservative and often religious right-wing opponents of such divorce laws are arguing that the practice deprives people, mostly men, of due process in a relationship, and hurt families, and by extension, society. Republican lawmakers in Louisiana, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Texas have discussed eliminating or increasing restrictions on no-fault marriage laws. Defenders of the laws, which states started passing a half-century ago, see legislation and arguments to repeal them as the latest effort to restrict women's rights, following the overturning of Roe v. Wade and passage of abortion bans across the country, and say that without such protections, the country would return to an earlier era when women were often trapped in abusive marriages. Okay, but let's be clear, that's literally what they want. They're not even really hiding it. Quote, no-fault divorce is critical to the ability, particularly the ability of women, to be able to exercise autonomy in their own relationships, in their own lives, said Denise Lieberman. Conservative commentators such as Matt Walsh, Steven Crowder, and lawmakers such as the Republican Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio have argued that the laws are unfair to men and hurt society because they lead to more divorces. The divorce rate in the United States increased significantly from 1960, when it was 9.2 per 1,000 married women, to 22.6 in 1980. But by 2022, the rate had fallen to 14.5. Oh, that's interesting. On the increase in divorces, Vance said in 2021, one of the great tricks that I think the sexual revolution pulled on the American populace is the idea that these marriages fundamentally, they were maybe even violent, but certainly they were unhappy, and so getting rid of them and making it easier for people to shift spouses like they change their underwear, that's going to make people happier in the long term. I remember the first time this issue got brought up and it came to my attention was actually Steven Crowder. And it was Steven Crowder, right about the same time we learned that he's abusive as fuck. Remember that video came out, the security video that they got from his home, and he's yelling at his wife and not letting her take the car, and just completely and utterly unreasonable and unhinged. Anyway, soon thereafter, he's out there decrying the idea of no-fault divorce laws. So let's be clear. Their stance is women should be forced to stay with men. Because also, let's be extra clear on this point.